SEP Fanfic Readings presents Aurelian by BittyBlueEyes. Chapter 27. Meet the Grangers. Hermione apparated beside the same head she had a week prior, with Aurelian in her arms and Draco's hand in hers. She put Aurelian down and looked quickly around to make sure that no muggles in the area had seen their sudden arrival. When she felt confident that she had not been seen, she turned around to look at Draco. Rather than surveying the area, Draco was staring down at his attire. "You're sure I look all right?" he asked. "You're wearing the exact same outfit Harry gave you last week," Hermione smiled. "My answer is the same as it was then. You look good." "Yes, but when you said it then, you were just trying not to insult me," he reminded her. "Which I failed at, obviously. You look great, Draco," Hermione said earnestly. Draco looked down at his button-down shirt and black trousers one last time. "Are you sure it looks okay with the sleeves rolled up?" he asked. "Yes, it's perfect. Really, you look wonderful. By Muggle standards, you are quite nicely dressed, but you still look casual," she reminded him. "It suits you well. You look great." Hermione took Draco's hand and started pulling him onto the sidewalk. His other hand already grasped Aurelian's. "I look great, too," Aurelian started happily. He wore Muggle clothing again also and was quite thrilled about it. It felt like playing dress-up to him. "Yes, you look quite handsome," Draco told him. "Daddy handsome, too," Aurelian returned. "Mummy handsome, too." "Yes, she's quite pretty," Draco agreed, causing Hermione to look away bashfully. When Draco finally peeled his eyes off of the woman beside him, he started appraising the neighborhood they walked through. "The houses here are quite nice," he commented. "Is this where you grew up?" "Yes," Hermione answered, gazing fondly around the street. She remembered taking walks here with her parents and even learning to ride her bicycle on that very sidewalk with her father running after her. "It feels like home and so foreign at the same time." "Not much has changed, except perhaps the neighbors. That's likely a good thing, though. A few too many of them had witnessed different pieces of my accidental magic." "It was no surprise, then, to get your Hogwarts letter," Draco smirked. "Well, of course it was," she said. "But a lot of things made sense then. I didn't believe, even for a moment, that it was a joke." Both of them fell into silence as they thought back to their beginnings at Hogwarts. Draco thought back to some of their first classes together. He had known immediately that she was a Muggle-born, but he had been quite still impressed with her natural talent with magic. He had been rather bitter about it, along with her great enthusiasm, but looking back, he thought she was adorable. Draco," Hermione said hesitantly, "I wanted to say, well, when you greet my mother today—" "Don't kiss her hand?" Draco asked with a smirk. Hermione chuckled in response. "Don't worry, Hermione. I know how to play social games. I was just uncertain when I met your mother. I wasn't sure your family's social status, and, well, she kind of conducted herself as my mother would, so I treated her accordingly." "First," Hermione responded, "Muggle society doesn't really have levels of status anymore. Just about everyone is treated with the same respect, except, perhaps, for heads of government. They're treated quite properly to their faces and talked about horribly behind their backs." "And second?" Draco asked after a pause. "What?" "You said first, so I'm assuming that you were going to add a second." "Oh," she said, having no desire to explain further. "Second, you'd rather not compare your mother to mine," Draco chanced. Draco knew that he had guessed correctly when she looked away in an attempt to hide her embarrassment. "I don't blame you. My mother was horrible to you. It wasn't meant as an insult, though." "I know, I'm sorry. I'm sure that your mother is usually quite cordial," Hermione told him. Hermione, really quickly," Draco said, pulling her to a stop. He had seen her slowing and staring at a home near them. He hadn't much time left to speak to her privately. "Yes?" Hermione asked. "What is a dentist?" he asked anxiously. "What?" Hermione asked, taken off guard by the random question. "You said that your parents both bore the title of doctor, and I knew that those were like Muggle versions of healers, but then you said that they are dentists. What are dentists?" Draco repeated. Hermione laughed. "Sorry. I know you're both curious and uncomfortable, but it just seemed silly to hear that question asked so seriously. Sorry. Muggle healers, doctors, don't have potions and spells to aid them, so healing is much more complicated. Because of this, there are many fields of specialized study. Dentists tend to people's teeth and gums. Muggle hygiene, when it comes to the mouth, isn't as efficient as wizards' mouthwash, and they need their teeth professionally cleaned from time to time, and repairs if there are problems." When Hermione finished her explanation, she was glad that he had decided not to ask her in front of her parents. They would have felt greatly insulted to hear their daughter talk about how inefficient their profession was in comparison to wizard care. "Okay," Draco said with a nod. That answer explained enough for him. He really didn't care about whatever their jobs were, he just didn't want to be ignorant should it somehow become a topic. We stop standing here? My hungry, Aurelian piped up. You think Grandmom Helen have muffins? I don't know, Aurelian. Why don't we go find out? Hermione replied with a smile. He was a good boy and quite patient for his age. You ready? She asked Draco. Draco nodded. Hermione gave his hand a squeeze. He smiled down at her, but took his hand from hers and put his hands in his pockets. It would be uncomfortable to greet her parents while he was holding her hand. Hermione knocked on the door, and Draco looked down at the beaming toddler that waited with great anticipation. He wondered whether Aurelian was excited to see his grandparents again, or whether he was just looking forward to the food. The door opened, and Hermione's mother stood before them with a kind smile. Good morning, Mum, Hermione greeted. Good morning. Come in, Helen offered, standing to the side. Hermione entered and hugged her mother. When she looked up, she saw her father. Good morning, Dad, she said with both hope and apprehension. Dr. Granger waved her forward and pulled her into a tight hug. She pressed her cheek hard to his chest and inhaled deeply, relieved by her father's acceptance. She released him and took a few steps back, looking rather sheepish at what she felt was childish behavior. Draco, you've already met my mother, Dr. Helen Granger. I'd like to introduce my father, Dr. William Granger. Mum, Dad, this is Draco Malfoy. A pleasure to meet you, sir, Draco said. He waited to see how Hermione's father responded. He normally would have offered a handshake, but when Dr. Granger only nodded, Draco returned the greeting. It's nice to see you again, Mr. Malfoy, Hermione's mother greeted politely. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Granger, Draco returned, correcting himself partway through. Having two in the house addressed as Dr. Granger was rather confusing. Hi, Grandmom Helen, Aurelian said brightly. You have more muffins? Hello, Aurelian, Helen beamed in return. Yes, I do happen to have some muffins prepared. I know how much you liked the last ones, so I was sure to make more for today. Yay! He cheered. Are you hungry? She asked. Yes, really hungry, Aurelian answered quite pathetically. Then why don't we all head to the table? She suggested. Helen reached out to take hold of Aurelian's hand and led the way to the dining room, where a large meal was spread out over the table. Helen helped Aurelian into a seat on one side of the table, while Hermione and Draco sat on the other. Hermione's father waited for the others to be seated before he took his position at the head. Draco quickly scanned the room and those around him, appraising his surroundings. It was a rather nice-looking home. His eyes fell on Hermione's, and he felt himself relax some. He quickly snapped back into reality when her father cleared his throat. His gaze moved from Hermione to her father, and then back to his empty plate. Please, help yourselves, said Helen as she started helping Aurelian with his plate. Hermione reached for a platter of eggs and spooned some onto her plate. She then reached for a basket of breads. When she looked up, she saw that Draco still hadn't reached for anything. She offered him the basket. He nodded and began serving himself, though he never had to serve himself at home. It was not foreign to him. He had served himself all through school and often when he visited others' homes. The circumstances, however, made him feel very awkward. He felt very self-conscious, merely placing food on his plate. He was certain that it was Hermione's father that made him feel that way. Draco could feel the man's eyes on him, scrutinizing him. Unable to help himself, Draco looked up at the man called William Granger, the father of the girl he had quickly come to adore. The man had yet to speak a single word since they had arrived. Just through the short walk to the dining room, Draco had seen a few family portraits in which Hermione's father looked like a rather kind and pleasant man. It was hard to believe the man on the other side of Hermione could be that same person. He looked so stern and a bit intimidating. So how have things been this week? Hermione asked conversationally. Not bad, Helen answered, adding a sausage to her plate. It was rather stressful in parts, but your father did take me to the cinema Friday night. She smiled at her husband, who gave a soft smile in return. Draco had only glimpsed it for a second, because the instant Dr. Granger looked at him, his stern expression returned. I would consider asking you about your week, but I'm sure there is not much that you can tell. Hermione felt a little guilty. She had confessed to her mother that they were still working on a very serious case, but that she wasn't able to disclose any information about it. But we have a number of other things to talk about, like this quiet young man sitting at our table. To be quite honest, Mr. Malfoy, Hermione has told us very little about you. Draco gave a small nod, unsure of how to respond to that statement. He happened to be rather glad that Hermione hadn't said much about him, as anything she might have said probably would have caused them to think badly of him. Well, said Hermione, Draco and I didn't really know each other very well in the past. I understand, Helen replied, but we know even less. Why don't you tell us about yourself, Mr. Malfoy? Do you mind if I call you Draco? No, please do, Draco answered quickly, as being addressed as Mr. Malfoy in that setting felt awfully strange. Everything about the visit felt awfully strange, though. He took a breath as he entered the most awkward part, discussing himself. And I'm not really sure what to say about myself. I'm an only child. I was born and raised in the wizarding community. I started school at Hogwarts at the same time as Hermione. And where were you educated before that? Mrs. Granger asked curiously. At home, by my governess, Draco answered. A governess? She said with surprise. Yes, most children in the wizarding community are educated at home. Some families form small groups to be taught by tutors. Some parents educate their children themselves. Then there are others, like myself, that are privately taught by a governess, Draco explained. I've also heard of a few families, those that have a muggle-born parent, that send their children to muggle school. But that isn't as common, as it's hard for young children to keep the international statute of secrecy. I see, she answered. She became quiet as she thought on what he had just explained. It made her wonder what kind of education Hermione was planning for Aurelian. When no one else tried to continue the conversation, she felt that it was her responsibility to break the silence. So, what is it that you do now? I work for the Ministry of Magic and International Magical Cooperation, said Draco. That sounds interesting, she replied. Hermione was as surprised and pleased as Draco that her mother was making an effort to be cordial and polite in conversation. It can be, Draco told her. I do enjoy the traveling that's involved from time to time, but for the most part, it's just pushing papers. I make sure documents are signed, filed, and delivered properly. Tell us about your parents, Hermione's father requested. Draco was stunned to be addressed by Mr. Granger, but then became rather anxious about discussing his parents. He wasn't sure what to say about them. Well, my father, Draco started slowly and hesitantly. My father is not with my mother and me any longer. Hermione looked at him sympathetically. It obviously caused him great pain to mention his father. She couldn't imagine how difficult it must be to know that the man that had raised him was sentenced to imprisonment in Azkaban for the rest of his life. I'm sorry, Mrs. Granger apologized sincerely. We don't mean to pry. We're only curious about you. Draco nodded. He couldn't help but take a glance at Hermione's father. The man did not look at all apologetic for Draco's discomfort, and it appeared to him that the man certainly had every intention to pry where he could. Though he knew that Hermione's mother was honest in merely being curious and acting kindly, Draco could feel that she was uncomfortable with him. He knew that she did not approve of him, but was trying to be open-minded for Hermione's sake. The effort she made spoke volumes to Draco. The woman obviously cared very much for her daughter. What about your mother, then? Am I right in assuming that you still live with her? William asked, sitting back in his chair so he could appraise Draco better. The man was making himself comfortable to properly interrogate. At least, that was how Draco saw it. Yes, sir. I have taken over my father's position as head of our home. My mother, I consider myself close to her. She does not work. Well, unless you consider the great time and effort she puts into shopping and dinner parties as work. He smirked as he said it, remembering how he and Blaise joked about his mother's profession. Well, that's not entirely true, or fair to her. While she does enjoy hosting large dinner parties, she does many for charity. She has also helped St. Mungo's plan a few charity balls elsewhere. Though St. Mungo's is the largest scale charity events she helps with, she also supports some protection of rare magical creatures. Her heart lies in the personal scholarship she offers to some students that wouldn't otherwise be able to attend Hogwarts. Hermione stared at him, her mouth slightly parted in speechless astonishment. She had known that Narcissa Malfoy occasionally liked to attend charity dinners, but she had no idea just how involved she was in them. She felt ashamed to admit, even if only to herself, that she believed that the charity Narcissa showed was simply an outward show. She felt wrong for judging the woman so harshly. She then felt quite bitter about the newfound guilt when she remembered how rude the woman was to her at dinner 2 nights ago. She could not be blamed for her judgments about Narcissa. It was obviously the way the woman wished to be seen. I see, William Granger said in response. But I can't help but ask, where does she find the money for all these charities? Surely you don't make enough money with the ministry to support your home, your mother's spending habits, and the many charity events she attends. It was quite obvious that Dr. Granger believed that Draco was lying. The man looked angry. No, sir. My salary... Draco was struggling for a proper way to explain himself. My employment with the ministry is not as much for financial purposes as it is for personal growth and to be an active part of society. Both Hermione's mother and father narrowed their eyes as they dubiously scrutinized their guest. Aurelian looked around at everyone at the table, unable to understand what was going on. Draco comes from a very old and, wealthy family, Hermione uncomfortably offered in the way of an explanation. In taking the position at the head of the family, I inherited the financial obligations. I've inherited my father's investments and have already made a few of my own, Draco explained further. He didn't know what Hermione's parents might have been thinking, but he felt that it was better to explain a little further to satisfy them. Ari, please use your utensils, said Hermione. Draco looked over at his son, who was sticking his thumb into his scrambled eggs, and smiled. Conversation was becoming rather heavy. Seeing Aurelian smile and allowing himself a tiny chuckle did much to lighten him. Mr. Malfoy, I'm going to admit to you that I do not know much about the wizarding world. I have heard, though, that there is a belief that people with long wizarding bloodlines are considered to be above people like my Hermione, simply because her parents are muggles, Mr. Granger said. Hermione looked aghast that he would bring up such a thing. There are some people that believe that, yes, Draco said flatly. Some people. Do you consider yourself to be in that group? For if I remember properly, I believe it was your name tagged in some of the angry and tear-filled rants that Hermione came home with. Your name, I believe, was labeled as my daughter's greatest tormentor, Mr. Granger stated. He looked and sounded quite calm, but for his flaring nostrils. Dad! Hermione berated. She could not believe that he would bring up such a thing in front of anyone she knew, and most certainly not as an accusation like he had. My family raised me to believe that muggle-born witches and wizards are inferior. I admit that. For part of my life, I believed it. I am ashamed to admit that I was unkind to Hermione during our school years, but my opinion since then has changed. You are certain it has? Because it seems to me that you are quite uncomfortable in me and my wife's presence, Mr. Granger quipped. Meaning no disrespect, sir, but I don't think you mean this engagement to be comfortable, Draco replied. Hermione smiled softly. She loved her father, but she was glad to see that Draco was not going to take her father's provocation, nor would he rise to it. And I would not desire Hermione's company had my opinion not changed. She was actually one of the first to make me question that belief. I didn't understand how someone that was supposed to be inferior was as proud, witty, and clever as she. I no longer live by those beliefs. In fact, I know that your daughter is above me, Draco proclaimed, glancing at Hermione. Hermione was rather surprised by his declaration. Mr. Malfoy, I'm going to get straight to it. I know that my daughter fancies you, and I am not convinced that you're good enough for her. I agree that she is above you, and I want to know just what your intentions are for her and for my grandson, Mr. Granger said frankly. Dad! Hermione shouted. William! Mrs. Granger admonished, scowling at her husband. I believe it is a perfectly fair question, Mr. Granger defended. Draco sat back in his chair, taking the same position as Mr. Granger as they scrutinized one another. I agree, said Draco. It is a fair question. Mr. Granger nodded. I have come to care about your daughter very much. I enjoy her company. As for intentions, I have no specific intentions. I intend to enjoy the time I get to spend with her so long as she will have me. As for my son, I intend to be a father to him. And should your relationship with my daughter break, Mr. Granger pushed on, I sincerely hope that it never does, but my relationship with Hermione will have no bearing on my relationship with Aurelian. He is my son, and I intend to fill the role of his father in any way that I can, supporting him financially and emotionally, Draco declared. Mr. Granger's eyes narrowed as he considered Draco. Mrs. Granger quickly took advantage of the pause to take hold of the conversation herself. So, Hermione, she said, I didn't really get to speak to Harry the other day. How is he doing? Is he still with Ginny? He's doing all right, as well as can be expected under the circumstances, and yes, he and Ginny are still together, Hermione answered. She was very grateful to her mother for forcing another conversation. She had had quite enough of her father's grilling. Still no ring yet? She asked. No, he still hasn't proposed. Someday, though. I'm sure of it, Hermione smiled. What about Uncle Albert and Aunt Lorna? Have you heard from them recently? Yes, just the other day, actually. Paul is about to graduate from university, and Sarah is pregnant. Mrs. Granger was excited to announce. Sarah? Really? Hermione asked, no longer making play conversation. That's wonderful. When did they find out? Just a few days ago. Aunt Lorna is thrilled. I always thought she and Peter were a perfect match. Are they still going to live in France with Uncle Horace? Hermione asked curiously. No, Sarah decided that she'd really like to raise her child here. She'll be moving back to England in only a few months. Hermione's mouth fell open. That's wonderful. Hermione's enthusiasm quickly started to drain. Sarah was a very dear cousin of hers, and she was very excited to hear of her return, but then she realized how difficult things would be. By the look on her mother's face, Hermione understood that her mother had already had the same thought. How was Hermione going to spend time with Sarah? How was she going to explain a son that was nearly 3 years old? She angrily forced the thought from her mind. It was not the time to think about it. She would figure out an answer later. She would make it work. She always did. "So tell me about Paul," Hermione said, forcing conversation once again. The rest of the meal was played mostly between Hermione and her mother, though occasionally Mrs. Granger asked Draco little things about work and such, things she considered safe subjects. When the meal was complete, the group made their way back to the foyer. "Mummy, I has to use the toilet," Aurelian announced. "It's the first door on the left," Mrs. Granger informed him, pointing down the hall. "Where's left?" Aurelian asked. "I'll help him," Draco offered, taking his son by the hand. Hermione smiled and watched him leave. She appreciated his perceptiveness. She had really wanted to speak to her parents privately for a minute. "Dad, why did you have to do that to him? You embarrassed me terribly. He didn't deserve that," Hermione said with a pout. "It's a father's right," Mr. Granger said without remorse. "The first boy you bring to meet us, and it just so happens to be a name that you inspired us to dislike." "He's grown up, Dad, and I gave as good as I got when we were in school," Hermione protested. "I admit that I was skeptical," said Mrs. Granger, "but he does seem like a nice, responsible boy. It's obvious that he's rather taken with you. He's rather good-looking as well." "He is all of those things. He's great and absolutely amazing with Aurelian, too. I really hope you come to see that, Dad," Hermione said ardently. "He's not as bad as I expected," Mr. Granger admitted somewhat grudgingly. "You're going to give him a chance, then?" Hermione asked hopefully. "I haven't much of a choice, have I?" Mr. Granger responded. A small lopsided smile formed as he looked fondly at his daughter. "It's quite obvious that you have feelings for him. Just be careful with yourself, and don't be afraid to hex him if you need to." "Thank you," Hermione said sincerely, giving her father a hug. "Mummy, the soap smells yummy like apples," Aurelian announced as he reappeared, sniffing his freshly cleaned hands. Draco emerged behind him, with his hands in his pockets of his trousers. He still looked uncomfortable and was relieved to be leaving shortly. "We want to thank you for joining us today, Draco," Mrs. Granger said with a smile. "I hope that you might join us again soon." "Thank you very much for having me. It was nice to meet you both," Draco said. He was rather stunned when Mr. Granger extended his hand. Draco tentatively accepted the handshake. "Be good to them," Mr. Granger said seriously, giving Draco's hand an extra firm squeeze. "Of course, sir," Draco answered with a nod. "Well, see you next week," Mrs. Granger told Hermione. She knelt down to meet Aurelian's eye to eye. "And we'll see you, too. You take care, okay?" "Bye-bye, Grandmum Helen," Aurelian waved with a big smile. "Goodbye, Aurelian. I look forward to seeing you again," Mr. Granger told him, holding his hand out to him. Aurelian stepped forward and hugged the man's outstretched arm. "Bye-bye, Grumpy Pa." Aurelian smiled at him before releasing his arm. He was innocently unaware of his mispronunciation. Mr. Granger looked up at his wife with concern, but she just chuckled. "Bye, Mom, Dad," Hermione smiled, opened the front door, and followed Draco and Aurelian out. "Can't be as bad as your mother, you said," Hermione chuckled as they started down the sidewalk. "I'm so sorry, Draco." "It was uncomfortable, yes, but I understood your parents' concern," Draco assured her. "Other than the light grilling, it was rather nice. Your mother seems kind." "She is. She thinks you're good-looking, too." Hermione grinned, expecting him to be embarrassed. "Well, yes, but everyone knows that," Draco smirked. "Oh, aren't you Mr. Modest?" she snickered. Grumpy guy call him Mr. Malfoy," Aurelian told her. "That's Granddad," Hermione corrected. "So what's the plan now?" Draco asked. "All we have planned is a nap for Aurelian when we get home," Hermione announced. "No," Aurelian pouted. "No nap." "Yes, nap," Hermione said firmly. "What about you?" she asked Draco. "No plans before dinner. I have to make sure I'm home then, so that I can redress and make sure I'm presentable for visiting Mr. Parkinson," he replied. "Why? Did you have something in mind?" "No, not really. But I thought that if you were interested, we could watch another film," she suggested. "I promise not to fall asleep this time." "That sounds great," he said, taking her hand in his. "No nap," Aurelian pouted softly.